today's topic is about psychological barriers to our spiritual growth. And, so sorry. So, a lot of times when we try to increase in our, ibadah and strive closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a lot of things that come in the way, and we need to always assess and evaluate, what are these things that are interfering with our growth. And, I don't know, the noises. Sorry about that. Okay, so as Muslims, we always have to put ourselves under the microscope and evaluate, what are the things that are keeping me from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What are the things that are keeping me from, improving my character, improving the things that I need to in life, and essentially strive towards change, right? And that's what we're supposed to always be working towards, to improve our state, not just on a mental, emotional, physical level, but obviously on a spiritual level as well. So, there's so many parts that make up a human being, and we always have to assess all the different aspects of ourselves. And psychology, is in the topic says the psychological barriers, right? And psychology is really important here because, psychology is the study of the self, right? So when you study yourself, you understand all the aspects that make up who you are, and that's your mind, your emotions, as well as, the behaviors that you display, and essentially it studies why we do the things that we do. And if we don't evaluate these things, we're going to find ourselves stagnant and not moving forward, because you can't know what to change unless you know where you're at, right? So I'm going to go over a few barriers, that come between us and the change that we want to make. And it's important that when we're, learning about these barriers, that we understand, how it relates back to the relationship that we have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how it plays a role in our ibadah, how it plays a role in the dua we make, and the change that we want to make in our lives. So the first barrier that I want to talk about is the lack of understanding that we have about who we are. And like I said, we're not just made up of a physical system. We have the spiritual aspect of ourselves, but we also have a psychological aspect. There's a psychological system that exists within us. And just like every system that exists in this world, every system has the components that make up that system, right? And every system has a certain flow and a certain orbit that allows that system to function effectively. So if you look at the solar system, for instance, you know that all the planets have to revolve around the sun, right? And if the planets revolved around anything else, there would be chaos. That's just the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created that system. That's, the components, but you also know that there has to be a certain orbit, there has to be a certain flow. And, if the planets revolved around anything else except the sun, it wouldn't be that harmonious and that, stable orbit that we see and we know exists. So, and even if you look at your physical systems, you have the respiratory system and the digestive system, and even those systems have the components that make up that system, but there's also a flow to that system, right? And if it flowed in any different direction, or, if any little thing was off, you'd feel it, you'd know. There would be chaos in that system. So when you're studying anything, essentially, it's not enough that you know the components. You have to know what kind of flow needs to exist in that, right? So when we look at our psychological system, we know that we have our mind, right? And we have our heart, and we have our nafs that that holds our ego. We hear a lot about the ego. This nafs is this pleasure-seeking part of us, right? And then we have our heart that, this spiritual aspect of ourselves that Allah put within it, a spark and like a desire and a longing for Him. This is the same spark that Allah put in the heart of Ibrahim alayhi salam made him go in the time of, complete shirk, to go out and, think that the sun is his God and to think that the moon is his God, It's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in our hearts that longing and that desire to seek for him, And then there's our nafs, the pleasure-seeking self. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us our mind, right? This rational part of ourselves that absorbs knowledge and interprets it and helps us process and understand the world that we live in, right? And we have the emotional side to ourselves. So we have all these aspects that make up this psychological system within ourselves, right? So it's not enough to know, a lot of us, we know that this exists. We know we have a nafs, right? We know we have a heart. We know we have a mind, right? But we don't know and we don't evaluate how these entities within ourselves should function in a way that serves us in the best way possible and allows us to serve our Creator as well. So I always say, it's not enough to know that these things exist. We have to know which one should be in the lead, how should they function. And, it's just like we said that the planets, they have to revolve around the sun for there to be peace. Well, within our system, our heart, this spiritual heart that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, within it a spark that longs for him, this heart should be the king of this psychological system. And we don't learn it this way because even in here, in the West, there's a dialogue that supports us, worshiping the intellect. We worship the mind, we depend on the mind, we depend on logic, and if we can't understand something, we feel this chaos, right? This instability within us. Because essentially, a lot of us function as if the mind is the central part of this psychological system. And, even Albert Einstein, he said that, we have this intuitive side to us and we have this rational side. And he said the rational side, our brain, is the gift. Is the servant. And our intuitive side is the gift. He says what we do is that we serve the servant, but we ignore the gift. So we've made our heart the servant. And what we do is we basically serve the brain. We do everything to serve the brain, when in fact our brain should be the servant. So our brain is there for us to absorb information, interpret it, utilize it, but it's there to serve our heart. And if it's not serving our heart, then we're not utilizing our brain the way it should. And think about it in your own life, how much we're exposed to so much knowledge and, and how much information we take in every day, but we don't utilize it to serve our heart because it's almost like our mind is the destination. Okay, I've done my part, I've already, I've absorbed knowledge and, as if like that's the goal. But the brain is there to take that knowledge, interpret it, understand it, but then it's the servant at the end of the day, and it has to serve the heart. And that heart is the king of our system. And if all these entities revolved around anything else, we'd always find instability. And you'll see this a lot in life, when things happen that we don't understand. For example, when we go through experiences and we can explain it, we're at peace, right? But a lot of times we go through experiences and it's not 1 + 1 = 2, we can't find the answer, right? And so we put a burden on our mind to think again. We're like, find the answer, you have to find the answer. And, we put a burden on our mind that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not put on us. And it's interesting because more research is showing that the heart actually has an intellect of its own. The heart has the ability to see truths and derive truths from life that the brain cannot. And this is something that is already in the Quran, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes tells the heart to reflect in the Quran, and not the mind. There are ayat that say, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about signs, He says for our mind, for our brain to comprehend, but other times He talks about our heart. And He talks about how sometimes the hearts are blind, which indicates that our heart has an ability to derive truths and meanings from life that our brain cannot. And we need to understand this because, we need to understand that there's a hidden power within our heart. When the heart is attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah continues to remove veils of, He allows more understanding to be revealed to us. He keeps removing the veils that are on our hearts. The closer we get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the closer this heart connects with the source of that spark within it, then that heart is able to perceive truths from life, that you, no matter how much you try to logically understand, the heart is already at peace. It understands because it's attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So understanding the entities that exist within ourselves and knowing that this heart of ours should be the king, it should be the one that I feed the most, it should be what everything else serves, is a huge component of understanding how to navigate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because in order to navigate and to come closer to Allah, you have to know what tools you're working with. You have to know, what did Allah give me that I can use to strive towards Him? And how does the system within me work? And you know, what should be the orbit here and what should be the flow of, you know, this system? And so it's really important to understand, because, you know, we always talk about the nafs and, you know, we need to tame our nafs, and it's really important, but essentially we also have to understand, you know, is my mind serving my nafs or is it serving my heart? When I seek knowledge, you know, am I taking that knowledge to build up my ego and to build up my, you know, my nafs, or is it there to, you know, to fuel this heart that needs that fuel to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So it's constantly about what you're feeding every day. And honestly, that should be a question that we ask ourselves every day, you know, am I feeding, like going out, you know, starting the day with the intention that you want to feed your heart the most, you know, that you want to make sure that, you know, as you face your day and you know, that you're aware of all these entities that exist within you. And when you start to do that, you start to be aware of which one of them is taking the lead. So you'll engage in actions and you'll be like, you'll start to be aware that that's my nafs talking, that's my nafs acting, that's not my heart. You know, that's not the heart that seeks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's acting. And this awareness will lead you to understand it and see it more and more in your actions. And so this consciousness and understanding of who we are is crucial to understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, he said that man arafa nafsahu arafa rabbahu. Whoever knows himself knows Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So knowing Allah, you know, takes a lot of introspection. It takes a lot of putting yourself under the microscope and evaluating what Allah has already put within you so that you could know what you're using to navigate towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you think about it, when you know anything of Allah's creation, you know, it should bring you back to Allah. So when you look at, you know, when you study the solar system or when you study the planets and, you know, when you look at the sun or when you appreciate any aspect of Allah's creation, you're always, you know, we say subhanallah, and it should remind us of Allah, and it should remind us of the creator and the source of it, right? Same thing when you study yourself. Be careful, you know, especially in the world that we live in today and all the self-help, you know, resources out there. Remember when you're learning about yourself that you're not the destination. You know, that when you're seeking to understand who you are and you're seeking to improve yourself, that you do not get to a point where you're so self-absorbed that you've made yourself the destination, right? We seek to understand ourselves and to improve ourselves because we're seeking Allah. Yani even in ibadah, you know, we have to be very careful, like, because a lot of times we seek the spiritual high, but we don't seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We seek that uplifting emotion and the good things, the good feelings that come with ibadah and worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we forget that that's not the destination. That's not what we're seeking. We're seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So anything that you embark on, whether it's, you know, improving yourself or understanding yourself or understanding or knowledge, the knowledge is not the destination, you're not the destination, the emotional, the spiritual high is not the destination, we're seeking Allah here, you know? And that should always be the end, because if we don't stay focused on the destination, studying and seeking knowledge and, you know, reading or understanding ourselves could actually take us in the wrong direction. So it's important, like, that's why Imam al-Ghazali's statement is really beautiful, because, you know, he brings it back to Allah. He says, man arafa nafsahu arafa rabbahu. So if you embark on understanding yourself and it doesn't bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then there's something that you need to evaluate there. So the second barrier I wanted to talk about was our understanding of our Creator. So man arafa nafsahu arafa rabbahu is a perfect segue into this, because, you know, knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a crucial aspect, and our lack of understanding of Allah actually is a huge barrier in coming closer to Him. And, you know, if you think of your mind, you know, from a psychological perspective, we're constantly, as we grow older and as we grow up, we're always acquiring beliefs and thoughts about things, right? So, you know, we have to evaluate what are my beliefs and what are my thoughts about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is my opinion about Allah? And, you know, they did a research on religious struggles and how there are certain religious struggles that actually cause people to experience depression, anxiety, and a lot of emotional issues. And, you know, the first and main religious struggle that they found was people's understanding of their Creator and people's understanding of, you know, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and their relationship with Him. And it makes complete sense because, I mean, take a child with their parent, right? And a child who doesn't have a good opinion of their parent, and they're going to live their life with a lot of agitation, especially if they feel like their parent never loved them, or they feel like their parent didn't want good for them, you know? That's such a crucial relationship. And so just that relationship, if a child doesn't feel that, you know, a parent has those good emotions towards them, they will definitely experience agitation. So imagine your relationship with your Creator, you know, who created your parents and the reason for your complete existence, you know. And we need to constantly evaluate how we think about Allah, how we think Allah is with us, and how we are with Allah. And, you know, this opinion shapes so many things because, you know, we're not necessarily always aware of it, but it has a huge impact. So, you know, there are people, you know, Allah has 99 names and attributes, right? But a lot of times we identify with some and not with others, right? And this is really the essence of our ibadah, is to constantly know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's completely normal. I mean, you know, depending on people's experiences and upbringing, you're going to identify with an attribute of Allah and maybe not others. So some people will identify with Allah and they'll understand, you know, His rahmah, right? But there are others who only identify with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being, you know, like a punisher, someone who sets down consequences. And there are people who only identify with that aspect, maybe because of their upbringing, maybe because of their experiences, but that's how they view Allah. They never experienced Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Al-Wadud, you know? They never experienced Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Ar-Rahman. Or maybe they know it up here, but their heart has not yet felt the truth of that, you know? So it's really crucial to evaluate, you know, how you identify with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And, you know, for example, there are many thoughts and many opinions of Allah that people have that sometimes they don't even know that they have. It's like, it's subconscious, it's something that they're not aware of. Like, for example, if I get too close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will test me, you know? Allah will give me trials because Allah tests those whom He loves, right? We hear that. So there are people who are not aware, but subconsciously they don't want to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though they won't say it. But there's a fear there that if I get too close, Allah's going to test me, right? Or, you know, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves others more than He loves me, right? And Allah will come through for others in a way that He's not going to come through for me. You know, and I see this a lot, you know, when I give therapy and I see clients struggles with understanding Allah, some you know, like I remember, you know, a client was saying that he feels like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like a boss. You know, He gives him duties to do and he has to do them and checks them off. You know, and a lot of us, we deal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of duty, obligation, not because we delight in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not because we understand that everything that He has commanded us to do is because of His love for us. You know, so maybe the love is not there, you know. And so, other, you know, examples is, you know, I feel abandoned by God. Even though I'm not saying, people don't necessarily say these things, they don't make these statements, right? But it's there and it needs to be evaluated, you know. You need to constantly evaluate how you feel about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And, you know, like for example, even salah, right? We know that we have to pray and we know that we need prayer, right? But we pray a lot of times as if Allah needs it, even though, astaghfirullah, Allah does not need it, right? But we pray in a way when we rush and when we need to get back to our dunya, we pray in a way, even though we're not verbally saying it, but subconsciously we're saying that, okay, Allah, I did it, here you go. What does that say? what does that action really is saying? It's saying that I did it, it's for you, here you go, right? But we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us prayer because we need it, right? And it was so important that it took the Isra and Mi'raj for it to be commanded to us, right? And we know that, salah comes from the word sila, which means link, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not put us on this earth and leave us to ourselves. So He gave us salah, and He made it mandatory, and He made the consequences high because that's how badly we need it, right? So think of a mother and her child who, there are some things that a mother will tell a child to do, and she maybe won't put a consequence on it, right? But then another thing that she wants the child to do, she'll put a consequence, right? Why? Because maybe this action she knows that her child needs to do. For example, coming to the dinner table and eating or finishing their food. Even though the child maybe doesn't want to eat, right? The mother will say, well, you don't get dessert, for instance, right? But why does she do that? It's out of love, right? Because she knows that, even if you don't want to, she knows that her child needs to eat and needs to come to the table. And the consequence is there so on those days when the kid doesn't feel like eating, he still comes out of fear of the consequence, right? But even though there's fear of the consequence, there's still love, right? And the mother loves the child. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rahmah towards us is far greater than a mother to her child, right? But we deal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala constantly in terms of obligation and duty, without really understanding that everything that He has commanded us to do and not to do, is a product of His love for us, and is a product, and it's because we need to do it. So this is a part of evaluating not just how you view Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but how do you view the ibadat that you're doing? How do you view the acts of worship, especially salah, because salah is the #1 link. It's your #1 orb of protection. It's your, it's basically the first link between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we need to evaluate, how do I approach salah? How do I feel about salah? Do I do it with a heavy heart? Do I feel like it's an obligation? A lot of times when we feel heavy in our heart, we always just say, oh, I have such a bad heart, it's my heart, it's bad, Sometimes these feelings send you messages, listen to your heart and see what it has to say, because, this heaviness or lack of heaviness, not necessarily because you're bad or good, these are all just messages telling you what you need to work on, Whenever you feel agitation, you should always explore that and see, what is it trying to tell me? Why do I feel heavy when I go to salah? Is it because I don't understand it? Is it because I don't understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why do I feel Allah is obligating me to do this? Why do I feel like Allah is telling me to wear hijab? Why do I feel like, you have to constantly evaluate why you're doing something, but why you think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to do it as well, to explore that, and to also evaluate how you view Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's just amazing because the other two, they had the research showed that there were 3 main religious struggles that contributed to people's depression and anxiety. And the first one was the person's relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second one was about the duties and the acts of worship. And the third one was conflicts between that and culture and, and society, which is another thing as well. We experience this a lot, how many things are in culture, are in Islam, that culture tells us to do that Islam doesn't, or vice versa, right? So evaluating this and evaluating your beliefs, thoughts, and opinions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is truly important. In therapy, when you're trying to help a client, strive towards change, one of the main components is to help them understand their thinking patterns, right? So because your whole life you're acquiring beliefs, you're acquiring thoughts and ideas about things. So you have already interpreted, how you feel about certain things, And so that's what your brain is constantly doing. It's constantly gathering information, interpreting it, and and making beliefs about certain things. So you have beliefs about your values. You have beliefs about what parenthood means. You have beliefs about who Allah is to you. And some of those can be flawed. Some of those can be inaccurate. Just because we have a belief and something that we're so used to thinking our entire life does not mean that it's true. Does not mean that it's accurate. Think about what it takes for converts, reverts to come to Islam. it took a lot of putting everything they believed out on a platter and evaluating it, right? And assessing it. Just because we are Muslim does not mean we shouldn't be doing that. We should still evaluate our beliefs about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we do not know how much culture has affected that. We do not know how much our own nafs, our own upbringing, or our lack of knowledge has affected that. You know, we look at, a lot of times we don't realize what it took for reverts or for people to come to Islam. You know, it took a lot of constantly, you know, putting themselves under the microscope and evaluating everything that they've known to be true. And there are so many things, I mean, Muslims, and so many things that we believe about, you know, our faith that we attribute to be true, and we really have to evaluate that, you know, especially when it comes to our understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has 99 attributes, you know, and many of us will go through life identifying with just one. And I remember one shaykh once taught me such a beautiful lesson, you know, and he was saying that every opportunity that you go through is every experience that you go through is an opportunity for you to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a different light. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will sometimes put you through experiences to introduce you to a different aspect of Him, right? Because Allah created us to worship Him, right? The word ibadah, you know, actually the word ibadah has many meanings, but worship, and also it's also one of the forms of love as well. Like from an Arabic linguistic perspective, it's one of the forms of love, and you can't love someone until you know them. So essentially, we are here to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because the biggest joy and bliss comes from connecting with Allah. And you can't connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without knowing who you're connecting with. So knowing who Allah is such a huge factor in getting closer to Him, in improving in our spiritual growth, in connecting with Him. A lot of times we wonder why we're not moving forward. Sometimes all we have to do is ask ourselves, when was the last time I read something about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or I increased my knowledge of His attributes, or I read the Quran while understanding the tafsir of it and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to tell me. You know, you can't love anything in life without knowing more about the thing that you want to love. And that's the same thing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He loves us, and that's always there, you know. But the truth is, the biggest joy in this world is connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and knowing Him. And so constantly evaluating what you believe about Allah is a huge contributor to our growth. And then the third barrier that I wanted to talk about was the lack of presence that we have in our life. And you know, a lot of times, and what is being present? It's being in the moment. It's living your life as if it's living your day as if it's your last day. And essentially, this is the lifestyle of the Sahaba, right? Is that they lived their day as if they wouldn't reach Maghrib, and they lived their nights as if they wouldn't reach the morning, right? And you know, nowadays they have this. There's a whole like psychological approach called mindfulness, right? And you know, mindfulness. It's a lot of what they use for mindfulness is Rumi's teachings, right? And Rumi's teachings are all founded upon the love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the love for the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, right? But they attribute it to Buddhism, a lot of the teachings of mindfulness. But if you study mindfulness, you will find it so deeply rooted in Islamic teachings, you know. And what is it essentially? It's being in the moment, it's being present, you know. And existential psychology says that an aspect of depression has to do with constantly being in the past, and an aspect of anxiety has to do with being in the future. So if you're in the future and you're in the past, you're not in the present, and this is where true change happens. It's paying attention to what you already have. The essence also of gratitude, right? Because when you're grateful, you appreciate what you already have. And if you don't know what you have, if you are not aware of what already exists in your life, in that day, in that moment, you're not going to know what you're working with, because you're in a different place in time, you know? And what are the past and the future? They're illusions. They're not real. It's not a reality. You know, they're not existing right now. But the present is the only reality, right? And shaitan will always come and will make you think of all the illusions and let you forget your actual present. So you'll find yourself worrying about things that have not happened, right, in the future. Yet there are things that are actually existing right in front of your eyes that you're completely ignoring, you know? And this is the tactic of shaitan. A lot of times we want to do something and like we want to take a step to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah tells us this in the Quran, how shaitan will promise you with poverty, right? When you have hope of Allah and when you want to strive closer to Him, He'll promise you with poverty. Poverty is a loss. It's not something that's just confined to materialistic wealth. Poverty is a loss, right? It's a loss of security. It's a loss of, it could be a loss of wealth, but it's essentially you feeling like you're going to lose something, right? And a lot of times what keeps us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like sometimes we'll want to move forward and then we'll think of things that, we'll for example, wanting to wear hijab, think of how we're going to lose out if we take that step, or wanting to pray at work, or wanting to leave work to go to Jum'ah, or, we're going to lose out on risk, right? So, evaluating, and shaitan always does this, and we also do this ourselves. We have to also recognize the role that we play, because it's not just shaitan, it's our thoughts. Being aware of what you're thinking and where you're at is so crucial. It's very important. And Imam Ghazali says, the first thought, if it's not warded off, it will eventually repeat itself until it manifests itself into your behavior. So nothing is ever disconnected. The way you think, the way you think of Allah, the way you think about yourself, the way you think of your community, your thinking patterns eventually reach your behavior. So constantly monitoring our thoughts so that we can be in the present, is really important. And it's not only going to help you get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it's going to help you, have just, essentially you're going to feel more, you're going to feel a better mental, emotional, and peaceful state, because when you're in the present and you're working with reality, you're not dealing with illusions anymore. You're not dealing with all the if-onlys, which the Rasul tells us to stay away from the what-ifs, or if only I had done this and this would not have happened, right? The Rasul tells us those are all, when you do that, you're thinking of illusions. You're not in the present. You're thinking of either in the past, if only I had done this, or you're thinking of the future when you say, what if that happens, or what if this happens, or, So you're anywhere but the present. And this is the biggest thief of your time, and the biggest thief of your sanity and your mental and emotional health, because you're everywhere except where you need to be. And you need to be in the present in order to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the best way to start, implementing this is in prayer. It's making sure that in the prayer that you are present. And that when you go to prayer, you go with your heart. You go with that spiritual part of yours that seeks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because even in prayer, we're constantly thinking, And our heart, like I said, it has the ability to, seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has the ability to understand truths that the mind cannot. And it's important that when you go to salah, that you're going with this heart longing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to practice being present in that moment. And if you can start practicing it in prayer, it's going to transfer into your life between the prayers. I always remember this too about being present. One huge factor of depression, they say, is that depression is the gap between where you are and where you think you should be, right? And I really think this is amazing, because most of the time, we're always thinking of what's the next step, right? And we're comparing it to our reality. And that gap between the reality and this illusion, or where you think you should be, actually can cause a lot of agitation and depression in a person's life, because you're not in the present again, right? You hate your reality, and then you're comparing it to where you should be, and you're not there yet. So you're not giving attention. Your present is empty because you haven't really been giving it any attention. And so that's why people sometimes, they feel that void, they feel that emptiness, because they're living for a time that has not come to existence yet, or might not even come to existence. So, implementing this concept of being present is really important. Another thing is be aware of, you know, we have one obstacle that interferes with our ability to be present is our discomfort with silence. And so think about, like, you know, when you get into your car, you automatically turn something on and you want to listen to something. You know, when you have some time, you pick up the phone and you call somebody. You know, we're a society, we're a feel-good society. You know, we have such a huge discomfort with silence. When it's silent, you know, we don't like that. It's uncomfortable. We're not used to it. And one of the key aspects, and they teach you this in mindfulness, is to be okay with the silence. You know, and the best way that we can be okay with the silence is to fill those moments with dhikr. And to be okay. You know, it's going to be agitating at first, especially if you're not used to it. But if you can train yourself that in those moments to just sit with yourself, you know, whether it's after Fajr, whether it's in the car, you know, you're driving, and to be able to sit in silence and do dhikr, you know, and connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you'll find that you'll be so much more conscious of your day and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. You're not going to be anywhere else, because when you connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you this awareness to be conscious of the things that He has given you, everything that exists in your life. And when you are grateful, when you practice shukr, that also does that. Because to be grateful, you have to recognize what already exists, right? And even if you have to start small, you know, gratitude is beautiful, because you'll never, once you start, it's like you'll never be able to really stop, because there's always something to be grateful for. So trying to practice little times in your day where you're present, or you have to remind yourself, you know, to give your day its part, you know, and it's an amana. I mean, every day, you know, paying attention to what that, because every day when you wake up, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, it's a gift from Allah. And I remember listening to a teacher, I always remember this, because he was talking about the concept of shukr, and he was saying that when you get up in the morning, you know, the dua, you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for giving you life after death. He says it's not alhamdulillah alladhi ahyaytana ba'da amatana, it's alhamdulillah. Like you wake up and you're just like, because Allah has just given you back your soul, right? So when you wake up, you know, don't just say it, like act like you're grateful, you know? Act like you're truly grateful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has just given you your soul back, has just given you that breath, because there are people who were not given that breath, and there are people who did not wake up that day, you know? But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you a new day, number one, that's a sign of His love for you, you know? And these little things, understanding these little things can break down these barriers that come between us and our growth. Because if we can wake up every day and realize, not just understand it, right? Because there's a difference between knowing and there's a difference between your heart feeling what you know, right? And Imam al-Ghazali will talk about this when he explains any concept. He'll break it down into levels. He'll say there are people who know this concept up here, and there are people who, like when he talks about the 99 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for instance, he'll say that, you know, there are a group of people that know the names. But he says, but that doesn't differentiate us from animals, because he says animals even know the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But he says then there are people who know it and their heart feels a response to those names. And then he takes you into different categories. The people who know it, their heart feels it, but you see it through their actions, right? So you have to always evaluate, what do I know, but what does my heart resonate with? Does my heart resonate with what I know? I'm sure that a lot of what I said is not new. A lot of us know that we have to do dhikr and the concept of prayer. We know these things, right? And that is why, you know, we're insan, because insan comes from the word nasiyah. You know, we forget. We need reminders, but when we remind ourselves, it's not saying, I know that. That's why we should never say that. You know why? Because even though you know it, your heart maybe has not yet known it. And until your heart knows what your mind knows, then basically it's your heart your mind is still the king of this inner system. Remember, the mind is there to serve the heart. So there are many things that we know, and most of the time when it comes to change, it's not that the people don't know that they need to change, or it's not that we don't know that what we should be doing, or it's not that we don't know, you know, the aspects of our deen a lot of times, right? We know. But what is keeping us from changing? It's that there's a disconnect between what we know and what our heart is, you know, is feeling and what our heart is experiencing. And when there's that disconnect, there's not going to be change, because this system inside of us is still not in orbit. it's still not the way it should be. So until the heart is the king of this inner system, where everything else serves it, even the nafs is in its place because it knows the heart is the king, then we can strive towards change. And the best example of this is Ramadan, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us 30 days. What are we feeding the most in that time? You know, our nafs and our physical self, they take the back burner, right? So the heart is like, okay, someone needs to lead, you know, so it has to step up to the front lines, because any system needs a leader. We know that, right? So in Ramadan, when you're depriving your nafs and when you're depriving your physical self, you know, your heart has no choice but to take the lead. And at the same time, in Ramadan, we're reading more Quran, we're doing more dhikr, so we're actually utilizing our brain to serve our heart. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us the true nature of where these things, you know, should lie. And in Ramadan, you know, we experience the sweetness because everything is in orbit the way it should be. Our heart is the king in Ramadan, right? And we're using everything to serve that truest part of us. And it's you know, it's a time of harmony, right? And we love Ramadan because of the bliss and the peace that we experience in that time. And that's because everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. Another huge sign of where, you know, these entities within ourselves lie is in sujood. You know, in sujood, you're taking this part of your brain, which is the frontal lobe, which is the part that actually differentiates us from animals. It's the highest functioning part of our brain. And you're taking this highest functioning part that's responsible for decision making, for, you know, complex way of thinking, and you're putting it to the floor. But even in sujood, in that place where you're closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your heart is still above your mind. That should show you the reality of their positions. The mind is not the king. You know, because in sujood, the truest, like, most purest position that we can take, our mind is still above our heart. Our heart is still above our mind. And nothing is a coincidence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, this is all part of His hikmah, is to show us that this heart is the strongest tool that you have to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So just a reminder for myself and for you to constantly be aware of which entity within you is taking the lead in your life. Is it your nafs? You know, is it your pleasure-seeking self? Is it this ego-containing part of yourself? Is it your mind? Are you constantly seeking knowledge and feeling like it's good? Well, you know, is the mind the king of this inner system? Or is it your heart? Are you leading with your heart? And this is a question we have to ask ourselves, you know, till the end of time. You know, which part is leading? Which part is the leading force of this inner system of mine? And to constantly not be afraid to ask questions, you know. If you have a question about an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, a lot of times, and we're hearing this so often now, you know, a lot of youth having struggles with Islam because they've had questions, you know, things that they, you know, genuine questions about Islam, about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, things that they have learned, things that, you know, were taught to them growing up, but they never questioned it, you know, so they go through life having this understanding of their creator and their deen, and never getting it answered, and at the same time knowing they have to practice it, right? But there's a conflict there. So don't always be open to the questions that come up, you know, and ask, and always, you know, seek answers and explore and reflect. And it's always important to understand that there's a psychology to us. You know, there's a mind at work, there's our emotions, there's our nafs, and we can't ignore these things because whether you think it or not, they're playing a role in your behaviors, even though you're not aware of them. So, you know, just a reminder to myself and to you to always just evaluate that and to try to implement more presence in your life and to remember that the only reality is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually put in front of you.